Hello, everyone, again. We'll go on with lecture. Today we'll talk about, we're going to talk about the Baroque period. The first composer we encounter is this guy here. His name was Girolamo Frescobaldi. He was a very influential keyboard composer. So keyboard means for a piano and harpsichord. And he was very influential. He's considered to be one of the most important early 17th century composer of keyboard music. Um, the other term you have to, there's another term that you have to know for the second exam, which is oratorio. The oratorio is basically a religious opera. So what happened is that in Rome, during certain periods, operas was banned, was not allowed to be performed. So composers turned to the oratorio. The oratorio is a new dramatic musical genre that emerged in Rome, and was in Latin, so it was based on religious story, not on a secular story. So um, in most cases, the oratorio did not have lavish costumes or complicated costumes or expensive sets because it was supposed to be performed for religious purposes. And one of the difference between the opera, one of the most important difference between the oratorio and an opera was the fact that an oratorio had a narrator. So in other words, there was someone who was recounting the story. So it was telling the story, was narrating the story. And there was one particular form of song, of aria. Aria means song, which was called the da capo aria. Da capo aria means repeated song. So an aria which has basically an ABA form. You have to know this because I will ask you this in the second exam. And as you can see, is underlined and in bold. So ABA form means when you have um, an A section, so you have a new first melody, and then you have a second melody B, and then the same melody again, or the same structure again. So that's why it's called ABA. One important thing is happening in the Baroque period is instrumental music. So instrumental music becomes very prominent, and you have some composers writing just for the keyboard, just for the instrument. So it can be the violin, it can be the harpsichord, it can be the cello, it can be other instruments. And so they started to follow some kind of structure in music. And one important structure that was very famous is the Corellian sonata. So the Corellian sonata is in four movements, so it's in four sections. A movement is basically a section, it's the same thing, just a different term. So you have four movements with slow, fast, slow, fast. So it's just a structure that these composers followed in order to compose new music. So slow, fast, so four movements. It was in binary form because you have an AB form. So you have AB, that's called binary form. Two complementary parts. You can listen to this piece. The other important form structure was the concerto grosso form. The concerto grosso form, I will ask you this in the exam as well, as you can see, is underlined in bold. The concerto grosso form is basically in three movements, not in four. So it's fast, slow, fast, right? And it's characterized by the fact that there is the entire orchestra alternating with small instruments, so small solo sections. So you have the entire orchestra playing, and then you have small groups of soloists of instruments playing. You have also the ritornello form in the concerto grosso form. Then you have a cadenza. These are all terms I will ask you in the exam. The cadenza is basically a section. Sorry, let me do this. A cadenza is basically a section in a concerto grosso form which is not written down by the composer, but it's improvised. So in other words, the composer, instead of writing down the music, it just tells the performer to um, perform whatever he likes. The ritornello form instead is very important for this concerto grosso form because it's basically it's like a refrain. So that's what ritornello means in Italian. It means refrain. Okay, and I actually made a graph here which explains everything. So the way a ritornello form works is you have a refrain, so ritornello, then you have a solo, right? Solo one, then another refrain, then another solo, then another refrain, then a third solo, then another refrain, then a fourth solo. So it's like in a rock music when you have a solo of the guitar, it's the same thing. So you have refrain, solo, refrain, solo, refrain, solo. Okay. And actually, you may have heard an example of ritornello form when you listen to Vivaldi's Four Seasons, which is very famous, one of the most famous compositions ever written. And I'm sure you have heard it before in high school or somewhere. And it was published in 1725. So he has four different sections. So it's kind of tells the story of the season. So it's the spring, first movement, then summer, autumn, and winter. And each section has three movements. And it's based on this poem, as you can see, this poem here. And what the composer tries to do is he tries to portray music, the images depicted by the text. So if you listen to the music, in fact, which actually will be in the next quiz too, you can see the ritornello, which alternates with solo violin and then other instruments. And what he tries to do, he tries to portray the sound of the birds, for instance, or the water flowing. It's kind of it's something that's trying experimenting with music. There's another important thing that is happening, and which is in London by with this composer Harry Purcell. Is a very influential composer of. He was the first, one of the first English composer to write operas in English, and his most famous opera is this one here, Dido and Aeneas, which is still based on a mythological story, but it's not in Italian; it's in English. And you can actually listen to, if you have time, listen to one of the lament, and if you click on this link you will be able to listen to the lament. It's a very beautiful piece. You should listen to it. Speaking of opera, in London, there was another very important composer. His name was Handel, and he was not British. However, he was from German. He was from Germany. He's German, but he traveled to Italy early in his life to learn opera, oratorio, another genre, and then eventually he moved to England where he found a job, actually very successful job for that time, and he became also an opera composer and an opera businessman. And very important, he used a lot of castrati. So there is actually, I'm not going to explain the castrati right now because it's complicated, but you should watch this. There is a documentary on YouTube, and you can find it. It's called Castrati BBC, and if you're into, you don't have to do, but if you have time, you should do it. And he explains what a castrato is. A castrato was basically male singers who were castrated when they were very young to preserve the high voice. And one of the most famous castrati who ever lived was Farinelli. His name was Farinelli, and they at this time they became very, very famous, very, very famous. Some of them were very successful, became very rich. But then eventually the tradition of castrati ended in the 19th century because it was abolished. Then the other important name, because the more we go on in the semester, the more you're going to see some names that you may know because they're more famous, like Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, very famous, who lived in Germany. He grew up in a small town in Germany. He first started as an organist. Then he still had a lot of church positions. Then eventually he moved to Kuven, where he was appointed Kapellmeister. Kapellmeister means chapelmeister. He was in charge of the musical organization of the church, and he was composing for the church. He was writing chamber music and orchestral music as well. Okay, very famous composer. He also composed the Well-Tempered Clavier, which is a collection of keyboard pieces. So if you actually play the piano, you may have encountered these pieces because if you play advanced or intermediate piano, you have to study those pieces. Are very important. There are basically 24 pieces which are called preludes and fugues, and they're just exercises for the fingers on the piano. I'm going to skip equal temperament for now, but I want to show you something about the fugue. So what is a fugue? A fugue is, it will be in the exam. A fugue is like a polyphonic piece. So you know what polyphony means because I explained this before. It's like different melodies performing simultaneously. And the fugue has many features, but the most important features are elements are the subject. So you have the theme, the main theme, right? The main melody. Then you have a counter subject, which is, as the word itself suggests, is different from the subject. So it's like it's a different melody. And then the exposition, which is the area, the opening section basically of the fugue, okay, which you hear the subject and which is presented in imitation. So you hear the subject and another melody, then the same subject again, then the same subject again. And then the episode, which is the section basically in the exposition and the other statements of the subject. Now, the audio when I play the video here is not great, but I will play this one actually. There's a graphic which shows you exactly what a fugue is. Let me play it. And of course, you can go on for a long time, but eventually has to end. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to play all the musical examples, but you should listen to a couple of those examples, including the one I showed you earlier, which was about the castrati. You should watch the aria, Farinelli aria, which is very, very interesting to watch. Is this one here is the first link here. And there is a movie actually about Farinelli. We should watch it if you find it on Netflix. So that was a few. Then eventually Bach moved to Leipzig in 1723, where he remained until he died in 1750. And there he worked again in churches, but he also worked as a composer and as a teacher. And he was a director of 4 different churches at the same time in the city. Now, this is pretty much what we cover until now. So that's all the material that I will talk about in this video. Okay, so make sure you read this, you watch this video along with the other video, the last video I sent, which includes material from the second exam. Okay, bye.